The spilled wine on the white linen looked like a bloodstain, but to Aria Thorne, it looked like a death sentence. She wasn't supposed to be on the 50th floor penthouse, and she sure as hell wasn't supposed to see the supreme boss of the city, Kwon Tae-moo, looking at her brother like he was already a ghost. Aria stammered a half-finished apology, her hand flying to her face to hide her shock, already backing toward the elevator. But the decision had been made the second the pizza box hit the marble floor. Whatever conspiracy had dragged this innocent girl into his line of fire just became Tae-moo's problem to dismantle, and he didn't care who he had to burn to do it. Before we continue this story and find out how a simple delivery girl stunned the city's most dangerous men, please subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these stories to life. The silence following the crash of the pizza box was absolute, the kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that precedes a storm. Aria Thorne stood paralyzed, her fingers still tingling from the vibration of the impact. On the floor, the yellow insulated bag lay crumpled like a fallen soldier, and the scent of pepperoni and cheap dough felt offensively mundane in this room that smelled of cold marble and lethal consequences. Across the sprawling penthouse, the man with the slicked-back undercut didn't hesitate. He was an enforcer named Jackson, and his movement was a blur of practiced violence. In one fluid motion, he pivoted away from the bruised man in the suit, Aria's brother, and reached for the weapon tucked into his waistband. His scowl deepened, his tattooed neck tensing as he leveled a finger toward Aria. "I've got the witness," Jackson growled, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that made the hair on Aria's neck stand up. "Nobody leaves this floor tonight." Aria's breath hitched. She looked from the gun to the man in the emerald dress, then finally to her brother, Minho. He looked pathetic, his face pale and eyes downcast, a white slip of paper trembling in his hand. He looked at her then, his eyes wide with a mix of recognition and absolute terror. He didn't call her name. He knew that to claim her was to kill her. "Wait." The word wasn't shouted, but it cut through the room like a blade. Kwon Tae-moo stepped out from the shadows of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He moved with a predatory grace, his presence so commanding that even Jackson's finger hesitated on the trigger. Tae-moo didn't look at his enforcer. He didn't look at the boss lady, Yuna, who remained seated with a terrifyingly calm gaze. He looked at Aria. He stepped closer, his expensive Oxfords clicking softly on the marble until he was standing just inches from the fallen pizza box. Aria felt the urge to scream, to run, to vanish into the shadows, but her legs refused to move. Tae-moo leaned down, his eyes never leaving hers, and his gaze drifted to the plastic-covered ID badge pinned to her gray hoodie. Aria Thorne, delivery lead. Tae-moo's eyes flickered toward the man in the suit, the man they had been moments away from breaking. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable in the set of the jaw and the shape of the eyes. "Thorne," Tae-moo whispered, the name sounding like a prayer and a threat all at once. Jackson stepped forward, the gun still raised. "Boss," she saw the wine, she saw the interrogation. "We can't let her walk." Tae-moo raised a hand, a single finger extended, and the enforcer froze as if struck by lightning. The boss turned back to Aria, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes lacked the cold vacuum of a killer. Instead, there was a spark of something else, a calculated curiosity. "You're late with the order, Aria," he said, his voice smooth as silk. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a clip of $100 bills, and peeled off 5 of them. He tucked the money into the front pocket of her hoodie. "Consider this a tip for your silence, and your bravery." He turned to his men, his voice turning to ice. "Lower your weapons. She's not a witness. She's the guest of honor." The heavy stack of $100 bills felt like lead in Aria's pocket, a weight that anchored her to a world she was never meant to inhabit. As the enforcer Jackson lowered his weapon, the tension in the room didn't vanish. It simply shifted, coiling around the elegant woman seated at the center of the chaos. Pyo Yuna didn't look like a woman who had just escaped an assassination attempt. She sat perfectly still, her blonde waves catching the light of the crystal chandelier, her gaze fixed on the spilled wine that was slowly devouring the white tablecloth. With a steady hand, she reached out and touched the base of the glass, tilting it just enough to watch the dark liquid drip. "Do you know why red wine is the preferred choice for a traitor, Aria?" Yuna's voice was melodic, lacking any trace of the tremor that was currently rattling Aria's bones. Aria shook her head, her throat too tight to speak. She looked at her brother, Minho, who was slumped in his chair, his face buried in his hands. "It masks the sediment," Yuna continued, her eyes finally lifting to meet Aria's. "It hides the bitter metallic tang of the dose, digitalis, just enough to stop a heart in its tracks and make it look like a tragic accident. A quiet death for a loud woman. Yuna's gaze shifted to Minho, and her expression hardened into something crystalline and sharp. Your brother was the one who poured it. He stood right where you are standing now, checked the vintage, and served me a glass of murder. The air left Aria's lungs. She turned to her brother, her voice a broken whisper. Minho? Tell me she's lying. Tell me you didn't... Minho finally looked up, his face a mask of sweat and shame. I didn't have a choice, Aria. They have my markers. They said if I didn't do it, they'd come for the house. They'd come for you and Mom. The realization hit Aria with the force of a physical blow. Her brother wasn't just a guest in this high-rise. He was a tool. The white slip of paper he was clutching wasn't a note. It was a debt tally, a record of his soul being sold to the men standing in the shadows of this city. Tae-moo stepped back into the light, his shadow falling over both siblings. He didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, which was infinitely more terrifying. He picked up the bottle of wine, swirling the remaining liquid. The Irish mob and the local syndicates, they love using family against family, Tae-moo said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. They knew Minho was weak, so they used him to target Yuna. And they knew you were the only thing he cared about, so they used your life as the collateral. Aria looked at the dosed bottle, then at the powerful man standing before her. For the first time, she didn't see a monster. She saw a judge. What happens to him now? She asked, her voice finally finding its strength. Tae-moo's eyes flared with that same calculated curiosity from before. That, he said, depends entirely on how much you're willing to do to save him. The penthouse felt colder as Tae-moo moved toward a wall of monitors that flickered to life at his touch. He didn't look back at Aria or her trembling brother. His focus was already miles away. So Dojin and Go Song-shik, Tae-moo said, his voice dropping into a low, clinical tone. They are men who hate the messiness of a direct war. They prefer the leverage in a slow squeeze. He gestured toward a series of photos. One showed a man with a jagged scar across his brow, So Dojin, shaking hands with a portly, well-dressed businessman, Go Song-shik. They were the architects of a new kind of cruelty, one that didn't rely on bullets, but on the crushing weight of interest rates and manufactured misfortune. They didn't just stumble upon your brother's gambling addiction, Aria, Tae-moo continued, his eyes reflecting the blue light of the screens. They cultivated it. They bought the underground parlor where he played. They ensured he won for the first month, then made sure he lost everything in a single night. It's a standard recruitment strategy for their disposable program. Aria took a step closer, her eyes wide as she saw a photo of her own neighborhood. It was a long-lens shot of her mother walking to the grocery store. The realization that her family had been under a microscope for months made her stomach churn. To them, people like you are ghosts, Tae-moo explained, his jaw tightening. You have no political protection, no high-priced lawyers, and no way to fight back. You are the perfect weapons because you are invisible. If Minho had succeeded in poisoning Yuna tonight, the police would have found him dead by morning, an apparent suicide fueled by guilt. Case closed. The rivals take over our territory, and the Thorne family name is erased from the record. The sheer scale of the manipulation was staggering. Aria looked at her brother, who was staring at the floor, a broken man who had been outplayed by monsters he couldn't even see. These rival bosses weren't just criminals. They were scavengers who fed on the desperation of the working class. They think I'm like them, Tae-moo said, finally turning to face her. His expression was no longer unreadable. It was a promise of impending violence. They think I see people as tools to be discarded when the job is done. But Dojin and Song-shik made one critical mistake. He reached out, his hand hovering near Aria's shoulder, not quite touching, but offering a strange, terrifying kind of sanctuary. They forgot that even a ghost can haunt you if someone gives it a voice. And they forgot that I don't like other men playing with my things, or the people I've decided to protect. The neighborhood didn't see many visitors like this. The usual soundtrack of the street, the rattle of the overhead train, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball, the distant shouting of neighbors, suddenly cut to a jagged silence as 3 blacked-out SUVs rounded the corner. They moved with a predatory slowness, their polished chrome reflecting the flickering neon of the corner store and the peeling paint of the tenements. Aria stood at the 3rd-floor window of her family's apartment, her breath fogging the glass. Her mother was behind her, clutching a worn rosary, her eyes wide with a terror that Aria couldn't soothe. They had expected a phone call, perhaps a threat whispered into the receiver, but not this, not the full, crushing weight of the Belandi Empire parked at their doorstep. Below, the doors of the lead vehicle opened in perfect synchronization. 4 men in tailored suits stepped out, their eyes scanning the rooftops with a cold, professional detachment that made the local street gangs melt into the shadows. Then the rear door of the middle SUV opened, and Kwon Tae-moo stepped out. He looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of crumbling brick and overflowing trash bins. In his charcoal suit, he looked like a god who had accidentally descended into a ruin. He didn't look up at the windows. He didn't hesitate. He simply walked toward the entrance of the building, the sea of onlookers parting before him as if he carried an invisible blade. Inside the apartment, the air grew thin. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway, slow, rhythmic, and inevitable. When the knock finally came, it wasn't the frantic pounding of a debt collector. It was 3 precise, firm raps that sounded like the closing of a vault. Aria opened the door. Tae-moo stood in the dim light of the hallway, his presence filling the cramped space until the walls seemed to shrink. Behind him, Jackson and another enforcer stood like gargoyles, their faces masks of stone. Tae-moo's gaze swept over the small living room, the frayed rug, the taped-up window, the photograph of Aria's father on the mantel. "Mr. Kwon," Aria whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. "My brother, he isn't here." "I didn't come for your brother, Aria," Tae-moo said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to calm the very air. He stepped inside without being asked, but he did so with a strange, dark courtesy. He looked at her mother and gave a slight, respectful nod that left the older woman breathless. He pulled out a chair from the small kitchen table, a cheap plastic thing that looked like it might snap under his weight, and sat down. He looked at Aria, his eyes dark and focused. "I am told So Do-jin likes to send his men here on Thursdays to collect his interest," Tae-moo said, checking his luxury watch. "It's 7 p.m. They should be arriving any minute. I thought I'd be here to greet them." The air in the cramped apartment grew thick with a new kind of silence, as the hallway echoed with a different set of footsteps, heavier, less disciplined, and accompanied by the wet slap of a heavy ring against the door. "Thorne, open up! We know you're in there with the old lady," a voice barked, followed by a harsh laugh. "It's Thursday. You know what happens if the envelope is light." Aria's mother began to tremble, but Tae-moo didn't move. He sat at the small kitchen table, his large hands folded calmly over the scarred wood. He gave a sharp, silent nod to Jackson, who stepped back into the shadows of the kitchenette. When Aria opened the door this time, her face was pale, but her eyes were fixed on the man behind her. 2 debt collectors pushed their way in, smelling of stale cigarettes and cheap cologne. They didn't see Tae-moo at first. The lead collector, a man with a thick neck and a sneering mouth, reached for Aria's arm. "Where's your brother, girl? Do-jin is tired of waiting for—" His words died in his throat as his eyes finally adjusted to the dim light, landing on the figure at the table. The sneer vanished, replaced by a look of pure, primal terror. "Tae-moo?" "Sit down," Tae-moo said, his voice as soft as velvet and as cold as a grave. The collectors didn't sit, they froze. Tae-moo pulled a thick, cream-colored envelope from his jacket and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud. "That is the full balance of the Thorne debt, plus a 20% convenience fee for your masters, Do-jin and Sang-shik. As of this second, I own every cent, every hour, and every drop of blood your bosses think they are owed by this family." He looked past the terrified collectors to Minho, who had emerged from the back room, looking like a ghost of himself. Tae-moo's gaze was piercing. "I didn't buy your debt to set you free, Minho. I bought it because a man who owes me is more useful than a man who is dead. Your masters think you are still their puppet. They think you are still waiting for the right moment to finish the job on Yuna." Tae-moo stood up, looming over the room. He stepped toward Minho, placing a heavy hand on the younger man's shoulder. It wasn't an embrace, it was a brand. "You are going back to them. You will tell them the poisoning failed because of a clumsy waitress, but that you are still in place. You will feed them exactly what I tell you to feed them. You will be my eyes inside their house, or I will let Jackson show you what happens to people who waste my investments." Minho nodded frantically, the weight of the new arrangement settling over him. He was no longer a victim of the rivals. He was a weapon in Tae-moo's hand. Aria watched them, realizing that the mercy of a mafia boss wasn't the absence of power, but the terrifying redirection of it. Her family was safe from the rivals, but they were now part of a much larger, much darker game. The transition from the shadows of the apartment to the neon-drenched luxury of the Onyx Lounge felt like stepping into a theater of war. Aria smoothed the fabric of her uniform, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She wasn't carrying a pizza box tonight. She was carrying a wire, a tracker, and the weight of her brother's life. Kwon Tae-moo stood in the darkened security suite 3 floors above her, watching the feed from a dozen hidden cameras. Beside him, Pyo-yuna sat with a glass of undosed wine, her face a mask of cold anticipation. They had leaked the information perfectly. The poisoning had been a near miss, the boss lady was shaken, and the delivery girl who saw it all was being kept under a loose, terrified watch at a predictable location. "She looks too nervous," Jackson muttered, leaning over the monitors. "Good," Tae-moo replied, his eyes fixed on Aria's trembling hands. "If she looked calm, Dojin would know it was a trap. Her fear is the only thing they'll believe is real." Downstairs, the plan began to breathe. Aria moved to the bar, her eyes scanning the crowd. She caught the signal from Minho, who was sitting at a corner table with 2 of So Dojin's most violent associates. Following the script Tae-moo had written in blood and debt, Minho looked up and pointed her out, the loose end that needed to be tied. Aria felt the air shift before she heard the footsteps. A man in a sharp gray suit, one of Dojin's inner circle, approached the bar. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of expensive gin and malice. "You're a hard girl to find, Aria," he whispered. "Dojin wants to have a word about what you saw in that penthouse. He thinks you might have something that belongs to him." "I don't know anything," Aria stammered, her voice cracking perfectly. "I just want to go home, please." "You'll go home," the man sneered, grabbing her upper arm with a grip that left an immediate heat. "But first, you're going to help us finish what your brother started. You're going to get us back into that penthouse, or your mother won't make it to Friday." In the security room, Tae-moo's jaw tightened as he watched the man's hand on Aria's arm. His hands curled into fists, the leather of his gloves creaking. He had told her she was a guest of honor, but seeing her used as bait tested the limits of his calculated patience. "They're taking her to the service elevator," Yuna observed, her voice steady. "They think they've found the back door to our world." "They haven't found a door," Tae-moo said, his voice dropping into a register of pure, lethal intent. "They've walked into the slaughterhouse. Tell the teams to hold. Let them think they're winning until they're too deep to scream." The service elevator groaned as it ascended toward the penthouse, but the sound was drowned out by the heavy, self-assured breathing of the men surrounding Aria. Dojin's inner circle felt like they were on the verge of a historic conquest. They held the girl, they had the traitor brother, and they believed they had the keys to the kingdom. When the doors slid open, the penthouse was bathed in a soft amber glow. Pyo-yuna sat exactly where she had been days before, her emerald dress shimmering like a warning light. Beside her stood Kwon Tae-moo, his arms crossed, his expression as unreadable as a granite cliff. "You're late, Dojin," Tae-moo said, his voice echoing in the vast space. The man in the gray suit pushed Aria forward, his hand still tight on her arm. "We brought the insurance policy, Tae-moo. Your girl, your traitor, and your pride. We're taking the docks, the transport routes, and the Thorne debt. Sign the transfer, or the girl starts bleeding." Dojin stepped out from behind his enforcers, a smug grin pulling at his scarred face. "It's over, Tae-moo. We've seen every move you've made. We knew about the visit to the apartment. We knew you were trying to play protector. You got soft." Tae-moo didn't flinch. Instead, he looked at Pyo-yuna, who calmly reached for a remote on the table. "You're right about one thing, Dojin," she said, her voice cutting through the bravado. "Every move was recorded. But not by you." The massive television screens on the wall flickered to life, but they didn't show surveillance footage. They showed a live stream of a high court briefing. A woman in a sharp blazer, Yuna's lead counsel, was standing before a phalanx of microphones, holding up digital transcripts and financial records. "At this moment," Yuna continued, "the Attorney General is reviewing the direct evidence of your disposable program, the blackmail of the Thorne family, the wire transfers to the gambling parlor, and the audio of your man in the elevator threatening an innocent girl's mother. It's all there. Every felony, every coercion, every drop of dosed wine." The smug grin on Dojin's face shattered. You went to the feds? You're the supreme boss. You don't talk to the law?" "I didn't talk to them," Tae-moo said, stepping forward as his enforcers emerged from the shadows, guns leveled with terrifying precision. She did. Aria Thorne, the girl you thought was a ghost, has been wearing a federal-grade wire since you touched her at the bar. You didn't walk into my penthouse, Dojin. You walked into a deposition. The sirens began to wail from the streets 50 stories below, rising like a choir of reckoning. The rivals realized too late that they hadn't been playing a game of territory. They had been documented like a virus being isolated for eradication. For the first time in his life, Dojin looked at Aria and didn't see bait. He saw the witness who was about to bury him. The aftermath of the penthouse confrontation wasn't marked by a single explosion, but by the rhythmic, mechanical sound of an empire being torn apart. While Seo Gojin and Go Sang-shik sat in separate interrogation rooms, blinded by the fluorescent lights of a world they could no longer bribe, Kwon Tae-moo moved through the city like a cold wind. He didn't use guns to finish the job. He used the ledgers Isabella had decrypted and the testimony Aria had provided. By morning, the rival bosses' shell companies were being frozen by federal agents, and their secondary assets, the warehouses, the transport fleets, and the underground parlors, were suddenly up for auction or seizure. Taemin stood in his office, looking out over the Potomac, a single physical document resting on his desk. It was the deed to Swift Link Logistics, the very delivery company Aria had worked for. It had been one of Dojin's favorite laundromats for dirty cash, a place where workers were treated as expendable shadows. The transition is complete, Jackson said, stepping into the room. The rivals' middle managers are either in zip ties or fleeing the state. The territory is ours. No, Tae-moo corrected, his voice quiet but firm. The territory belongs to the firm, but the logistics company belongs to the Thorne family. Aria arrived an hour later, still wearing the gray hoodie that had become her armor. She looked exhausted, the adrenaline of the sting operation finally giving way to the reality of what they had achieved. When Tae-moo pushed the document across the desk toward her, she didn't reach for it. "What is this?" she asked. "Justice," Tae-moo replied. "Your brother's debt wasn't just paid, it was liquidated. And because Dojin used your family's safety as collateral, the court-appointed receivership has allowed for a reparations transfer. This company is now yours. Your mother will never have to worry about a light envelope on a Thursday again. And your brother, he will have a legitimate job under your supervision." Aria looked at the keys resting on the paper. For years, she had been a ghost in the machinery of the city, delivering food to people who never looked her in the eye. Now, the machinery belonged to her. "Why?" she whispered, looking up at him. "You could have kept it all. You're the boss." Tae-moo stepped around the desk, stopping just inches from her. The predatory edge was gone, replaced by a fierce, protective pride. "Because you were the only one who didn't blink when the world tried to break you. And because in this city, power shouldn't just belong to the men who take it. It should belong to the people who survive it." The penthouse was different this time. The smell of iron-rich Cabernet and the oppressive weight of secrets had been replaced by the scent of fresh rain and the quiet hum of a city in the middle of a cleansing. Aria Thorne stepped out of the elevator, her movements no longer hesitant or rushed. She wasn't wearing the gray hoodie or the dark bomber jacket that had served as her camouflage for so long. She wore a tailored coat of deep navy, her hair no longer in a messy ponytail, but falling freely over her shoulders. Kwon Tae-moo was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the lights of Washington, D.C. flicker like embers. He didn't turn when she approached, but she knew he felt her presence. The predatory tension that usually defined him had smoothed into something more profound, a watchful, silent guardianship. "The news is calling you the anonymous whistleblower who broke the back of the syndicate," Tae-moo said, his voice a low vibration in the quiet room. "The city is stunned. They can't understand how a federal prosecutor and two of the biggest bosses in the underworld fell because of a delivery girl." Aria walked to the edge of the glass, standing beside him. She looked at the reflection of the room in the window. The white tablecloth was clean now, the dosed bottle gone, the ghosts of her brother's fear finally laid to rest. "I didn't turn them, Tae-moo," she said softly. "We did. You gave me the ground to stand on." "I gave you a wire," he countered, finally turning to look at her. His eyes were dark, but for the first time, they held a fierce, unshielded respect. "You were the one who walked into the lion's den. You were the one who decided you weren't going to be a ghost anymore." The subversion of expectation was complete. The city had expected a massacre. Instead, it got a revolution. The Mafiaboss whom everyone feared had become the shield for the family everyone ignored. Aria realized then that her life hadn't just been saved, it had been transformed. She was no longer a witness to the dark side of the city. She was the partner of the man who controlled its shadows. "What happens now?" Aria asked, looking out at the skyline. Tae-moo reached out, his hand resting lightly against the small of her back, a gesture of protection that no longer felt like a cage. "Now we run the city differently. No more disposables, no more invisible people." Aria smiled, a genuine, fearless expression that lit up the darkened penthouse. She wasn't the girl who had dropped the pizza box anymore. She was the woman who had survived the fire and came out holding the flame. As she looked at Tae-moo, she realized the greatest shock wasn't what he had done to her enemies, but what he had allowed her to become, a guardian in her own right.